evening. Tonight would not have been possible without the generous support of the Rosenfelder family in loving memory of Solomon Leibovitz, Arlene Rosenfeld, and Yossi Yosef, and by the Seif family in memory of Gideon Barnea, and by Rabbi Mark and Sarah Fishman in memory of Samuel Frankel on the occasion of his 25th yahrzeit. It is my honor to introduce three incredible speakers for tonight. You guys can come on up to the front if you want. First, Rabbi Alex Israel, my former Tanakh teacher when I was at Midrash Lindenbaum 20 years ago. Rabbi Israel is an author, educator, popular international lecturer who teaches at Midrash Lindenbaum and Yeshivat Eretz Hatzvi, and directs educational programs for the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies. Next we have Jessica Sachs, who is a postgraduate scholar in English and rabbinic literature, and also Jessica translates the biblical, Mishnaic, and liturgical texts for foreign publishers, right? And next we have Rabbi Mark Fishman, a brand new Oleh Chadash come to the Zion of Aver, right? And after 12 years of serving as a senior rabbi at Congregation Beth Tefillah in Montreal, he recently assumed the newly created position of Director of Adult Learning at Congregation Sha'ar Shemayim. And we're really excited that you are now part of the Efrat family. So we're going to actually start with a little clip from Rabbi Sachs. So it's a nice way to actually bring him into the room and really hear him speak. So yeah, coming from the screen. I apologize, the sound isn't perfect. We're gonna make do. And then after that, Sarah Joe's gonna take over and moderate a panel. So first, this.
Okay, Sarah.
Yeah.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Sarah Tessler. I'm the chairwoman of the board of the Women's Beit Midrash and also a teacher in the Women's Beit Midrash. Been in Efrat for 7 years now, and it's a pleasure to meet new people here and some old people, old learning partners. You are. You've been in the most hours of anyone I know. Also the founder of the Women's Beit Midrash.
Co-founder of the Women's Beit Midrash.
I welcome here tonight. There is nobody like Rabbi Sachs when it comes to showcasing Judaism and making one proud to be a Jew. And I think for everybody it's very hard that the flow of ideas and words and sentences and beautiful prose and a lot more than that as one sees if one opens up. It's amazing how Rabbi Sachs knew that his days were numbered. All of us know that our days were numbered, but he knew very well. And he really it feels like he set out to leave a real legacy. Not only in the books, but the fact that one can hear his voice and hear his oratory. And he packaged it all very nicely for us on rabbisachs.com. Means that it's so much of it, although there's such a feeling that it was cut short and we could have done with so much more, the fact that what there is so much is a tremendous gift. Like there's a sense that he worked so hard to fit that gift in and to make an impact that would last beyond his own lifetime. So we're here tonight to hear from three people who are going to start off by telling us what their connection was with Rabbi Sachs and what his Torah meant to each of you at a particular time in your life. So we're going to start off with you, Jessica, because you have the Bechorah as Rabbi Sachs' niece. Both microphones work.
Yes, you can take that one.
Right, well, this is a very strange thing to do, to stand here, sit here talking about your uncle in front of a group of people, many of whom knew him. Most of you I don't know, some of you know a little bit, and one of you is my father, and so much better qualified than me to talk on this subject. Altogether, it's a rather strange position for me to be in, but I'll try and give you a little bit of a sense of it. So I got to know my uncle by being born. It was my uncle from birth, and as a child, I mean, we didn't live particularly close to them in London, but they were our closest cousins. The rest of my cousins live in Israel. And so I think the kind of frontline aunt and uncle duties of the family were largely performed by my aunt. She was the one who sent the birthday cards and gave us tadpoles from the pond and things like that. And we would go around for tea, and my uncle would be there. He'd come out and say hello. But it was clear that he was in his room, he was in his study, doing important things, doing mysterious and important things that I didn't understand as a child. And as I grew up, I mean, I think this is not, I'm answering about the beginning, I suppose, but looking forward into as I was growing older, I think my relationship with him largely consisted of one ongoing conversation that was carried out in increments of, a few minutes whenever there was a family simcha, and the substance of that conversation was, and many people have variants on this story. As a child, he recognized a skill that I had and a passion that I had, which happened to be writing. I loved writing. Later, I wanted to translate. He identified that in me, and we would greet, we would laugh about this. The greeting that all of us cousins would get at the simcha would be Jessica, and they would greet us with this huge enthusiasm, and we would have this brief conversation, and he would encourage me with this writing, encourage me to take this skill that I had and use it for the greater good, and to talk to me about we need poets who are inspired by the sources. Yehuda Amichai was an atheist, but the God he didn't believe in was a Jewish God, and that we need more religious poets and source-inspired poets, and so on. That was the ongoing conversation as it in its variations. And later I came to work on his projects. He said we need good translators with a literary sense, and it brought me in to work on that. But in my childhood, the growing relationship that I had was with my own surname. He became chief rabbi when I was 9 years old, and at that point already he was a very known person. And so as I became used to answering that question, what is your surname? I immediately knew that there was a follow-up question. Are you related to? And I felt great awkwardness around that, because I felt that it came with a lot of expectations that I was not true to. So my habitual answer was only a niece. And as I was preparing for this, and this is the ultimate, are you related to, and what are you going to say about that? I recalled an anecdote of my grandmother's. My grandmother, you may have picked up a little bit of a picture of if you've read a lot of my uncle's writing. He mentions her now and then. She was what you might call a simple Jew. She was a wonderful Jew, and she was very kind of self-deprecating Jew. She was not somebody who talked a lot about herself, but she would tell this anecdote. It was in the 1940s, early 1940s in London. It was not a good time to find a shidduch as a young woman. The men were not there. And Shadchanim would send young men to the wine shop, the family wine shop where she worked, to check her out. And I don't know why she felt that she couldn't say what she wanted, or she wasn't listened to, but sometimes they would send an aspiring rabbi, a young rabbi, And when that would happen, she would light up a cigarette, and that would frighten them off. It's lovely to hear that story from your grandmother. And I think we fully appreciated the irony that she did all she could to avoid a rabbinic home, and then she got a chief rabbi as a son, which she was immensely proud of. But the other aspect of the story that I only pieced together long after she passed away was that actually she grew up in a rabbinic home. Her grandfather was an important scholar, Rabbi Funkin, and her father was also a rabbi. He had a shtiebel in the house, and he would be sitting learning Gemara, and he learnt it with his son, but he didn't teach his daughters, and that was always a source of sadness for her that she didn't have that. She was with her mother, who was totally denied any kind of education. She came from a very, very poor background, but she was the warmth and the wisdom and the heart and the brains of the home, and my grandmother was with her. And I think now about her double heritage, coming from a rabbinic family but not feeling the ownership of it because she didn't have the skill, and that perhaps my awkwardness when I was asked this question was partly something that I inherited, and that perhaps in a certain way my uncle also inherited that double heritage of the rabbinic and the non-rabbinic home. And certainly in his chief rabbinacy, he was very, very, always put such an emphasis on education for everybody, wherever they are, whatever their relationship to Judaism is, that they should not feel disenfranchised in the way that my grandmother was, and that we should all, certainly boys, girls, everybody, take ownership of this rabbinic heritage. Is ours.
Thank you. I'd like to open up, before my remarks, simply thanking the organisers for inviting me. It's lovely and humbling to be here just 2 months after arriving in Israel. And I'm very fortunate. I'm also like to thank the co-panelists, who I think I'm probably the least experienced of having a relationship with Rabbi Sachs. And certainly after hearing a personal family story like that and the connection, I realize that I'm speaking really of one of thousands of his Talmidim. There was one of the questions that was flying around on social media following his passing, which was, did Rabbi Sachs have Talmidim? I think this must have been asked from an American perspective of a YU model, where so many of the Rabbanim or the Rosh Yeshiva there have hundreds and hundreds of Talmidim, and Rabbi Sachs wasn't in the Beit Midrash classically as a YU Rav, and it was an emphatic response of everybody who considered themselves one of his Talmidim, saying, yes, he did, yes, and I'm one of them, yes, he did, and I'm one of them. And so my comments here are really taken from one of what could be thousands. I'm sure some of you in the crowd have a very similar experience. I first was introduced to Rabbi Sachs through his writings. It was 1998. I was spending a year in Israel prior to my undergraduate at university, and I had stumbled across a book titled One People. This was published by Littman Library in 1991. I read it in 98. He published it just prior to becoming chief rabbi, and it was a book that touched on the sociology and halachic perspectives of Orthodox inclusivity, as he would go on to title it. And it was very unlike nearly every other book that he wrote following that. I believe it was some type of maybe hybrid of part of his PhD thesis, and it is really tough going. It's really dense. It's really a tour de force of historical, pre-modern poskim approaches to how to deal with modernity. And it's fabulous. And if there's a phrase like, can a book change your life? If ever there was that question, can a book change your life? This was the book that changed my life, because I found at that particular point in my life, as an 18-year-old living in Israel, having really my life before me, not knowing what I wanted to do. I went on to study philosophy, not because I was drawn to philosophy, but because I wasn't sure what I wanted to study. But appreciating matters of the mind and a passion for the intellect, there was this question at the heart of my being: who am I as a Jew? And it was a very naive question. And I almost wanted a guide to take me by the hand and to be able to answer that question: how does Judaism look in 1998, and what should be the path of just normative Judaism? And I approached this question with a soul-searching and a tmimut. If the guide would have told me that Baba Chassidut would have been the path of what normative Judaism looks like, I would have said thank you and jumped in with both feet. And if somebody would have told me it's really a Reconstructionist Judaism, it's a conservative Judaism, it's a Reform Judaism, here was Rabbi Sachs laying out the entire gamut of the pre-modern and modern worlds, looking at how the various streams of Judaism had split and why, and the reasons that they had chosen their particular approaches. And here was his argument. He didn't call it modern orthodoxy, it was a phrase he never used and didn't like. But here was an argument for just Judaism. You know, C.S. Lewis, go on a tangent, has in the Screw Tape Letters that great letter where the writer says, you know, if you want to really get people away from the prize, call it Christianity and. You're familiar with Screw Tape Letters? Okay, it's an unnecessary tangent. But if you want to just get somebody off target, call it what the thing is and. So if it's Judaism and ecology, if it's Judaism and human rights, if it's Judaism and Zionism, like you're going to always miss the thing itself, as Kant would call it, the thing itself, if it's a Judaism and. And here was Rabbi Sachs giving, to my mind, an authentic Judaism that didn't require an and. It wasn't a modern Orthodox Judaism. It wasn't anything with an adjective attached to it. It was just pure. And it was a life-changing book. And upon returning back to England, I wrote to him and I said, your book changed my life. And I want to tell you this. And he wrote me back a letter in my first year at University of Manchester. And he said, thank you so much for writing and sharing this with me. And I write books for this reason. I write books for the reason that there might be a reader on the other end. And I'm so happy that it made an impact upon you. And he was incredibly gracious. Please, whenever you are in London, I want you to come to my home. I want you to look me up. I give you an open invitation. And that was really the how we met story, the origins. And just to close this answer, what then took place was he was about to publish The Dignity of Difference. And in 2000, 2001, he had already formulated the ideas for the book. And he wanted, prior to writing and publishing, to give an oral presentation of public lectures in London. And I would get the train from Manchester to travel back down to London. My housemates thought I was crazy because they weren't going to their classes and they were down the street in Manchester. And they were like, why are you getting on a train for 4 hours to go and hear a lecture? And those lectures were electrifying. And it was this introduction, not just through his written words, but through Rabbi Sachs as an orator. And in those early days, I think consistently throughout his life, and that video, I was just saying to Rabbi Israel, it was like sad watching that video, to see what has been lost. It was painful, it was emotional for me. And it never wavered, but in those early days, in 2000, he was so electrifying. The lectures were nearly 2 hours in length. It was a tour de force. It was an entire perspective of modern philosophy, how it fit in with his ideas of Judaism as he understood it. And in the middle of the lecture, peppered throughout, were references to modern culture, to movies that had only just come out in the movie theatres. There was like a cheeky reference to Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves. It was the time when the movie Speed, remember there's a bomb on the bus? And I'm like, how does he know about this? And it was so funny. And you know what, I've forgotten like nearly everything that anyone has ever spoken about Sfirat HaOmer. However, there is a bahag that says, this is another tangent, excuse me. There's a bahag that says if you miss counting with a bracha, you can't continue the and he presented this as off the cuff. And the way it's stuck in my mind is that it's like a bridge. Sfirat HaRoma is a bridge from Pesach to Shavuot, and you can't, if you imagine you're on a bus traveling on a bridge and there's a gap in the bridge, you can't get to the other side of that bridge. If there's a hole or a gap in that bridge, and then it just like so naturally, unless of course you're Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, then your ass can get over the bridge. And it was just this, and it was spellbinding. It was spellbinding, his humor and his humanity that was peppered throughout. Just a complete mastery of philosophy tied in with a Judaism that was pulsatingly alive and exciting was the beginning of my exposure and relationship to him.
Okay, it's difficult to add something when we have such direct experiences. So I'll just say I also, like so many of my contemporaries, met Rabbi Sachs as a student. I'd also read books and was stunned by them. When I was in university, I was a real groupie, which means that I used to sit and learn Gemara every night. But if Rabbi Sachs was speaking, wherever it was, it could be in Southgate, it could be where. I remember me, Sammy Rubin, and I know some of you know the names, so we'd all pack into the car, and wherever it was, we'd be there, sitting in the front row. I've still got the notes from all of those lectures, and we were really wowed by him. What was amazing was later on I had opportunities to interact with him in all sorts of contexts. But I'll tell you about two of them. One was when I had already decided to start learning for smicha, and once in a while I'd come back to London, and each time I'd phone up his office and say, could I have some time with him? And they always say, can you send questions? He'd always ask me to send the questions in advance. He would never look at them. And then he'd go through the questions in rapid question and answer fire. It was quite something. And after half an hour, his secretary would come in and say that half an hour's up, and always he'd say, why do you have to interrupt us? We're having the best fun, my whole day. All day I have to have meetings. Now I can talk Torah. But the first time I ever had a meeting like that, I saw at the end of the meeting him scribbling something on a little petek. He ripped off a piece of paper and he gave me his home phone number. And he said to me, Alex, whenever you have questions like this, if they're bothering you, call me up at home. He said, any time of day or night. I don't sleep. That's what he said. And he really gave me the impression that he meant it. I was, of course, too English and too scared to ever take advantage of this opportunity, but he really gave us all the sense that we mattered. And somehow, his amazing memory, he remembered us. I was walking down King George one day, and I see him walking the opposite direction. He sees me, and he remembered who I was. He remembered that I was studying smicha. I remember his precise greeting, Alex, how are you doing? When are you coming to suffer with us in England? Because he knew that I didn't want to come back to England. And when he heard that I was writing a book, he insisted, he said to me, before you publish the book, send it to me. I want to see it first. Who does that when you're the chief rabbi? Not only did I actually take him up on it, but he wrote the recommendation, which was on the fly jacket. And then he said, you've written about Malachim Aleph, where's Malachim Bet? And never let me go with that. So once I saw him at a lecture, he says, no, Alex, where's the next book? So I said to him, Rabbi Sachs, we don't all get a summer off every summer to write a book. What I should have said was, we can't all write a book taking off 6 weeks in the summer, which is what he used to do. And he looked at me and really feigned deep insult that I insulted him and said, you don't get time off. You take time off. And if you want to do something, you've got to make the time for it. And it was those interactions which were so incredibly meaningful, because he constantly was pushing us. He believed in us so much that we had sort of had to believe in ourselves. Like I kept on saying when I was trying to finish my second book, I better finish this, Rabbi Sachs is waiting for it. And it was just wild how much we felt empowered by him. And I'll just finish this little segment with my last meeting with him. I actually had finished my second book. And I wrote to Joanna, who ran his office, and said, I want to send you the book. Where do I send it to? She says to me, you're not sending him the book, you're bringing him the book. So I said, what do you mean? She says, you come to London and give him the book, you don't send him the book. Fine. So I went to London, and that was a year before he passed away, so it was our last meeting. And I will never forget that meeting because I came, of course, with my usual list of questions. That time he really didn't like my questions. So he told me I was talking nonsense. But so there was a bit of a silence. I ran out of questions. And he says to me, okay, Alex, so what can you teach me? I was like, what? And he said, what can you teach me? So he said, there must be something you're reading, something you've heard. I spoke to him about Tefillah and Dov Zinger's new book, like Konei Tefillah, some of you know it, and the whole revolution Dov Zinger was making in Tefillah here in Israel. He thinks for a minute, he says, yes, I really didn't write enough about Tefillah. So I said to him at that point, I said, Rabbi Sachs, I think you sort of wrote the Siddur. Meaning the Koran Siddur, but it didn't sound funny at the time. And he said, no, I didn't speak enough about the experience of Tefillah. I wrote about Tefillah, but not about the experience. And it was that humility and that ability that even though, he was Rabbi Lord, for him to turn around to me and say, well, what can you teach me? And he was always on the search for that sort of knowledge of everything, really embodied that idea of Halomegli Kol Adam, even from his students, which was quite something.
Sorry, before you ask the next question, you jogged my memory with the experience of tefillah, that quote. I remember a Shabbos table where I sat opposite him. I was also one of those nudnikim, following him wherever he would go, and if there was an opportunity of a Shabbaton, I didn't just attend the Shabbaton, I plonked myself down opposite him at the table. And I was talking to him. He either was bored of my constant nudging of him, or there was a Zmira that was being sung, and I will never forget this. He burst into a different person and sang the Zmira with a gusto. And he was moving his hands, and he was lit up, and it was incredibly passionate to see, emotional to see his passion of the emotional aspect of his Judaism. This was a great thinker. This was a Gaon Olam, and it wasn't something that stayed cerebral, but rather was something which emotionally overcame him. And the slither that I was able to see was him singing a Shabbat Zmira with incredible passion.
Well, thank you, all of you. What you said, Alex, reminded me that my late uncle, Charles Coleman, wrote the contract represented Rabbi Sachs when he signed his contract with the United Synagogue, and suggested to him that he needed to ask for those 6 weeks every summer if he wanted to still be writing books while he was going to be chief rabbi. But the amazing thing is not that my uncle wrote it into the contract. The amazing thing is the way Rabbi Sachs utilized those 6 weeks every year. Our next question is to ask each of you to put yourselves for a second into Rabbi Sachs's head. What do you think he would have liked to be remembered for? And what was the most important lesson that you personally learned from him?
Yeah, I think trying to put yourself in someone else's head is quite a risky proposition. And I sort of tried to consider this question. And I think my intuition is, or my sense of him, or what I read in his writings is, I have the feeling he would want to be remembered as a loving husband, loving father, loving son. Perhaps if he had to go further, as somebody of integrity, somebody who was in a position of leadership and never exploited it in any way for his own good, always tried to serve his flock and not the other way around, and was always on his task and doing it to the best of his ability. That's my intuition, and I think as a public figure and a teacher, he would want his path to be continued. He'd want to continue where he left off. I don't think he was focused so much on how he would wish to be remembered. But again, I feel a little chutzpahdik to make such a projection onto my uncle. But it's very hard to say what the most important thing I learned from him is, because it's hard for me sometimes to be sure, what I learned from him, what was just, it was sort of always there, because, I had this unusual situation of sort of gradually becoming aware as I grew older of him. But I'll tell you about something that he taught me directly, which is when I was sort of early high school age, I had a question that was bothering me very much. I think it bothers many of us in different forms, and the form it took for me is, how come the Torah doesn't forbid slavery? I was had learnt about the transatlantic slave trade, I was aware of slavery, and how can it be that the Torah doesn't forbid it? And in fact, it's quite clear that it barely discourages it. It doesn't discourage it. So my one Yom Tov, we called to wish my parents Chag Sameach, and my mother asked if I could ask him a question, and he said, of course. So she called me to the phone, and I asked my question. And he gave the answer that he's written and spoken about, which, to paraphrase and not do justice to it, he said, in the Torah, we begin as a nation in slavery, and the Torah makes it clear why. Because thou shalt not oppress the stranger, because you know the heart of the stranger, because you were strangers in Egypt. It was important that we should have that experience, because that experience is supposed to direct us towards a time when there will be no slavery, and we are taught to have that empathy and that care. However, the Torah spoke in the time in which it spoke, and the people at that time were not ready or able to hear a prohibition on slavery. And so the Torah puts limits in place. It sets us the final aim of arriving at a place where there's no slavery. Where we are, it limits the power that one person can have over another. It puts limits on slavery. And we're supposed to follow that trajectory until we arrive, as we have, at a place where we consider slavery prohibited, and on to a place where we actually abolish it. Now, as a teenager, I very much appreciated that answer. It certainly helped. I don't think I was fully satisfied by it, because nonetheless, it's a pretty major mismatch between the ethics that we understand and the ethics of the Torah itself and halakha l'maaseh of the Torah itself. How can we have that mismatch between what we believe to be right and what we actually enact as law? And I think over time, and I think now more, seeing after his passing the impact that he's had on such a wide crowd of people, and seeing him more, reading his writings more, and seeing his career as a progression, I think I now understand it better. That the Torah has two voices. It has a prophetic voice, which is screaming of injustice and suffering, and there's a priestly voice which honors order and authority, and which teaches in a language that people can hear. The priests and the Leviim were the teachers, and I think that he lived that tension and played those two voices as a duet in his work, and I think he achieved a lot by that, to bring the prophetic voice and the priestly voice together. There's the two voices that we need, and we need them to work together.
Rabbi Sachs want to be remembered for, and what was his greatest teaching? It's hard to answer that question. What would he want to be remembered for? Forget that question. His greatest teaching, I think that's also hard to answer because I once heard a panel speaking about Rabbi Soloveitchik, and one of the panelists was his grandson, Rabbi Moshe Lichtenstein, from just around the corner. I can say around the corner now. And he said that Yosef had a katanet pasim, which many commentators understand as a striped coat. And he said that the closer you are to somebody, the less you can see of them. Until you're really standing directly opposite them, and then you only see one singular stripe of them. You don't see the entirety of the rainbow. He said it's hard for me to talk about my grandfather because I was very close to him. To say what was a singular perspective, I'm not sure I have one. And those words come to my mind when I think what is the greatest teaching of Rabbi Sachs is. And so from an extremely subjective perspective, I would answer that Rabbi Sachs saw the Torah as a meta message of bringing about a phrase he quoted often from Rabbi Lichtenstein of societal beatitude. When the Torah was kept, society worked, and there was a goal of ultimate human flourishing. Whether we call that Yemot HaMashiach, whether we call that Geula, there was this target, there was a end goal. It wasn't simply about putting on your tzitzit or putting up a mezuzah or not cooking meat and milk. It was the world working. It was a return to Eden. And when he looked out at the world, he saw the fractures of the world and wanted to repair them, to quote one of his books. And I think that's why it was so important for him at a time of rising voices that were clamoring to be heard, that he would speak about listening so much. At a time of great political and religious violence, he felt that it was important to speak about religious pluralism. And those, I believe, are some of the legacies that he leaves, simply because he looked out and saw what was wrong and tried an attempt to go about making it right. And so to the degree that famous Gemara, if a person can be responsible for themselves, then they should be. If a person can be responsible for their family, then they should be. To the degree that they don't keep the family in check, then they're held accountable. To the degree that you can be responsible for your whole city, then you need to stand up and take the responsibility. To the degree the Talmud says that you can be responsible for your whole country. And then it goes in a hyperbole, to the degree that a person can be responsible for the entire world. So they are held accountable for their responsibility to keep the whole world in check. And I think he saw himself as a voice that was listened to far and wide, especially outside of the Jewish world, especially outside of the parochial, local world in which he inhabited, where the European Union was having a private meeting of just 3-4 of them, and they said, we need Rabbi Sachs in this meeting. Like kings, politicians, heads of state would say, we need Rabbi Sachs to be in this conversation with us. I remember him telling me that Angela Merkel would turn to him and say, Rabbi Sachs, what do I do now? Look at anti-Semitism rising once again in Germany. Tell me, I will do it. Please advise me. What do I do now? So this was an individual who had the world stage and ear attentive to his advice. And I think because he saw the difficulties in the religious violence, and because of how he saw a sense of an inability to talk and see the other. Those are the themes that he dedicated his life towards, because this was the call of the hour. Had it been a different era and a different generation, maybe he would have stuck to Parshanot. His whole career would have been dedicated to the Ramban and Rashi. But it's okay, I've spoken without a microphone for 12 years, it's fine. So I think because of the era in which he lived, he wanted to very seriously take on the world's problems, knowing that he was able to be a part of the solution.
Okay. We can manage without
The acoustics.
Okay, so it's difficult to, being the third speaker in the series. It's a little difficult.
Next time you answer first.
Yes.
No, it's okay. It's really okay. I've got plenty to say. This makes it easier. One of the things I would like to mention is the way that I think we can really learn from him is the way that Rabbi Sachs, in virtually every single speech that he gave, used to always find some way to pay tribute, to mention his wife. And he used to always talk about Elaine, so proud of her, with such admiration. And I'm sure, if he was asked, what would he like to be remembered for? I think it was that relationship which meant so much to him. And as Mark started before, he never had a speech where he didn't first thank people. And it was that Menschlichkeit which was incredible, which really, those lessons, and when he spoke about family, and when he wrote about family, it was really, really something. So I'll just share one idea which I think was really, well, maybe I'll share two ideas. I think the idea that Rabbi Sachs, first of all, really, really took, there was nothing that he didn't learn something from. And I wanted to maybe share one idea which is a very small idea, and one idea which is a huge idea. In an interview with Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg, which he gave sort of spontaneously, Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg from Boca Raton, Rabbi Goldberg asked him, what do we, he actually asked him, he said, Rabbi Sachs, do you ever have a difficulty with kavanah and tefillah? Because we have a difficult time. How do you deal with kavanah? Rabbi Sachs sort of laughed and said, what do you mean? We all have trouble with it. But he said something really interesting. He said, don't ever try to concentrate for the whole of davening. You'll never manage. And he said, and my trick is that I just take one phrase and I concentrate on it, and that's what I do. And he gave a gorgeous example. And he said, there's a Tehillim Kufmen Zayin, we say it in Pesukei Zimra every day. We talk about God building Jerusalem, restoring the exiles. He says that we call the God of history, the whole sweep, a millennia of history, exile and redemption. I'm going to miss out the next pasuk deliberately. After that, we talk about Moneh Mispal HaKochavim. The God counts all the stars, he's even got names for them. That's the God of nature. The entire universe, the cosmos. It's so huge. In the middle, there's one phrase. He who heals the brokenhearted, who bandages their sadness. He said, how do you put those three things together? The God of history with its huge expanses, then the God of nature, and then God cares about what Rabbi Soloveitchik might have called majesty and humility. Rabbi Sachs' comment was, you can double off that for an entire month, maybe for an entire year. And I think since I've heard it, I have been. And it was that idea that, anything he encountered, big or small, would feed into his Judaism. I think one idea that he's really given to us, and which animated so much, is indeed this notion of there's no division between the inside and the outside. And let me try and maybe explain. We had this lovely phrase that he had, that non-Jews are embarrassed by Jews who are embarrassed about their Judaism. Non-Jews respect Jews who respect their Judaism, or something to that effect. He always said, it's difficult to talk about Rabbi Sachs, he's always going to say it better than you do. But he had this, first of all, I remember he really shied away from the title modern Orthodox, because in his word he said, the Jews are a minority of the world, Orthodoxy is a minority of Judaism, and modern Orthodoxy is a minority of Orthodox Judaism. So he said, why would I ever describe myself as somebody who's a minority of a minority of minority? He said, the Parashat Shavua that we just started reading today, that Avraham describes himself as Nasi Elokim, or he's described as Nasi Elokim Ata B'tocheinu. The B'nai Chet, non-Jews, called him, you are a prince of God. And he really wanted to bring the word of God, not just to the Jewish conversation, not just to the modern Orthodox, not to the Orthodox, not even to the Jewish, to the global conversation. And he really, really believed that that was his mandate. In Dignity of Difference, he talks about the centrality of language. He was totally into the power of words. Hashem created the world through words. The first relationships are created through words. The covenant with God is created through words. And it's really interesting that diversity within society, the world starts with Safa Achat Udvarim Achadim. And Rabbi Sachs says, so many Mepharshim say this was a world of tyranny, because humanity tends towards diversity. Our children are different to us, much to our chagrin, I've got to say. We would all like them to be exactly like us, but they don't want to be. And therefore the world tends towards a diversity and multiplicity. And when God saw the world, Safa Achat Udvarim Achadim, he decided we had to have different languages. But this is the precise moment that Judaism begins. And he says, the notion of Bechira, which sounds so politically incorrect, he says you can't talk about the chosen people. He says it's supremacist, it's racist. But what we can say is that we have our language. And in the same way that we have a language and other people have other languages, he says in the same way as you have a child, you love that child. But you don't love the same way other people's children. But by the fact that you love your child so much, you understand that other people love their children the same, even though you don't love them the same. So we have our own language, which is called Judaism. And that's ours. And we love that. And we understand that others also have their own paradigms. Through our particularity, through our own depth of our Judaism, we can appreciate the world. And because we have a language, everybody else has also got a language. If we talk about ours, maybe somebody will find an echo in theirs. And therefore he said, the more I talk about the values of my Judaism, the more, I don't need to talk other people's language, I'll talk my language, and I'll talk it to the world. And that's where he had the most phenomenal stories about when he's on a plane, and I don't remember which one of the British Prime Ministers saw him learning Chumash Rashi and said, can I sit and learn it with you? I've never seen a book like that. And then Prince Charles joined in, or King Charles now, joined in and says, hey, I want to come in on the Chavruta. And suddenly he realizes that Torah has this power that can really affect the world, and that's why he became this phenomenal statesman of ideas. And that's why Angela Merkel and whoever it is around the world was looking to him for advice. But it wasn't because he tried to in any way dilute the Judaism he was teaching. He was convinced that the more he spoke about his language, other people who had other faith languages and other cultural languages would be able to feel an echo in their own. I think that's one of the things that really he bequeathed to us. And I say it when I'm teaching gap year students here in Israel, and they're going off to college, and I say, Rabbi Sachs would have definitely said to you, never weaken your pride in your Judaism. Don't think that because you have doubts about your Judaism, it will make you more able to swim in the waters of diversity. The more you bolster your Judaism, the more you will be able to contribute.
You're all outdoing yourselves, I must tell you, to the extent that I'm skipping over one of our questions because you've already really given us a sense of what we are lacking and what was so unique about Rabbi Sachs' leadership. But Rabbi Sachs spent an awful lot of time and many, many thousands of words and pages writing about anti-Semitism. And yet, there is an inner optimism in everything that he says, in all his books. How did his writings inspire you to be optimistic, despite the black picture which he's not afraid to cast?
Yeah, the voted I go first. Sorry, you're going to be sick of me in a minute. Rabbi Sachs spoke a lot about optimism, but he actually always contrasted optimism with hope. And he said that optimism, you might be optimistic or not, you might be an optimist, you might be a pessimist, you might have a good... But he said hope is something different, because optimism is something that might be or might not be. but hope is something that you create. Hope is something that you build. And he really felt that optimism was passive. Hope demanded, number one, courage, but it also demanded that we become active. He didn't see hope as something passive. And therefore he said that we always have to build to a better world. This was his explanation, that Judaism always saw itself not caught in a passive space. He loved to talk about the fact that the world is constantly trying to strip us of agency, trying to convince us that we are caught in a web of choices that are bigger than ourselves. Whether it is by psychological forces, if you want to talk in Freudian terms, or whether it would be, he said, Marx convinced us that the economy, we were in this web of economic forces, or in a Darwinian version, the survival of the fittest and natural selection, but we're not a plane. And Rabbi Sachs insisted, his whole book about the great partnership, about science and Judaism, to my mind is not really about science and Judaism. It's really about convincing people that you have agency, you have a choice, you craft your reality. Chas v'shalom, that we should agree with the evolutionary biologists that we are just a product of some sort of process of evolution. We can create meaning in this world. And that was really where he believed that the Jewish role never accepted the world as it is. Judaism is a religion, as he said, on the basis of last week's parasha about, when Avram argues for Sodom or whatever it might be, Judaism is a religion of protest. And we don't just protest the world, we protest reality. If it's not good enough, we have to heal the fractured world. So it's not just optimism, it's hope, and hope is something we create because we have choice and because we believe that Judaism is giving us a journey forward.
How does Rabbi Sachs gives me hope? If you ask my wife how Rabbi Sachs gives me hope, she might give you a different answer. Because at times I'm not always the most hopeful of people. And I think hope is extremely difficult. And being optimistic can be sometimes very difficult. And yet, paradoxically, that is actually my answer to you, how Rabbi Sachs gives me hope. Because I think Rabbi Sachs himself was not necessarily, to the way that I know him and through his writings especially, an individual that was a happy-go-lucky, skipping down the street type of person. And on many occasions, he spoke about his own despair. And if you read his essays, particularly on Parashat Pa'alotcha, the beginning of Bamidbar, he returns again and again to a feeling of uselessness and a feeling of not having achieved anything. And when he speaks about Moshe, I believe he's actually using Moshe as a foil for his own experiences through the chief rabbinate of those 22 years in England. There is a Moshe who, notwithstanding taking the Bnei Israel out of Mitzrayim, is not able to get away from the complaining and the grumbling of food. And this is the lawgiver par excellence, an individual that's going to show the grandeur and the vistas of what could be. And people just are grumbling about food. And I think that there is this moment of wanting to die, where the pasuk says, I can't take it anymore. It's simply too much for me. And I don't think there's an essay in Ba'alatcha that doesn't have that pasuk. And the very next pasuk, Im kachet asa li hargeni na, please, begging, na is always a language of please. Harog im matzati chen b'einecha. If I've done anything that you should find pleasurable, please, I beg you, kill me. And that's a devastating thing to say. And Moshe says it, and God's response is, Safali shivim ish miziknei Israel. They want food, they're complaining about food, get 70 elders. And Rabbi Sachs asks the question, why would bringing 70 elders assuage the problem of the people grumbling for food? And he says that this was Moshe's greatest breakdown. Moshe's greatest disappointment, and the solution that God provides doesn't seem to address the root of the underlying cause of the problem. And in an essay that he had written originally, the first cycle of Covenant and Conversation, that came out in 2002, 2003 for Ba'alatcha, he goes through masterfully the problems in Pshat, how it can be that this doesn't give a solution. 70 elders, how does that solve Moshe's stress, Moshe's worries, Moshe's concerns? And he says there's no simple reading here. And at the end, he gives the Ramban's approach, and he masterfully explains two weaknesses in the Ramban's approach. And he says it's a conundrum. There's a mystery. This does not make sense. And he says, I offer my own insight. I offer my own insight. And I just want to read from his words as far as what he said about his own struggles and his own moments that may have given him hope. And he says, there's two paragraphs, I hope you'll indulge me. These are his words. There can come a time in the life of any truly transformative leader when the sun of hope is eclipsed by the clouds of doubt. I mean, so let me stop there. No one is going to write that unless they themselves are speaking. Norman Lamb famously said, every drasha is a confession. So if you're saying that, then it's because you feel it. Doubt not about God, but about people. Above all, about oneself. Am I really making a difference? Am I deceiving myself when I think I can change the world? I've tried. I've given the very best of my energies and inspiration. Yet nothing seems to alter the depressing reality of human frailty and lack of vision. I've given people the word of God himself, yet still they complain. Still they only think about the discomforts of today, not the vast possibilities of despair. Moshe was the greatest, and then God gave him the greatest gift of all, one that no one else has ever been given. God let Moses see the influence he had on others. For a brief moment, God took the spirit that was on you and put it on them, so that Moses could see the difference he had made to one group, the 70 elders. Moses needed nothing more. He did not need their help. He did not need them to continue to prophesy. Those are the two Rambans. All he needed was a transparent glimpse of how his spirit had communicated itself to them. Then he knew that he had made a difference. I think Rabbi Sachs was struggling throughout his life. Am I achieving anything? I've given the people the word of God itself, and they're grumbling about the problems of today. And I think this bothered him, and I think it depressed him, and he comes back to this concept of depression. He writes about it explicitly in one of his books, and actually one of the books was an antidote to his depression. It was advice given to him by a therapist, where he writes with great vulnerability, write down all the good things that are happening to you. And that pamphlet became one of his booklets. And because of that struggle, he was able to see, I have made a difference, when he thought he didn't. And that was enough for Moses, he argues, and I think by extension it was enough for Rabbi Sachs to know that he made a difference, no matter how small. And that is the most hopeful of his teachings, and that's what gives me hope. And if I can just go, if just another 2 seconds, I'm sorry. In 2003, we got married, and I sent a wedding invitation to Rabbi Sachs' office, letting him know that I was getting married, and with the chutzpah of asking him to officiate the chuppah. And he wrote back, I'm so mazel tov, and I'm so honored that you would ask me to officiate. The burdens of responsibility, I'm not able to make it out to Israel for the time of the wedding, but I send you my brachot. In the letter that I sent him with the wedding invitation, I sent him this passage that he had just written for Ba'alatcha in 2003. And I said, I want you to know that it's clear you're not only speaking about Moshe, what I just said to you, it must be semi-autobiographical. I want you to know you've made a difference to me. And in the response back, where he apologized for not being able to attend and officiate the chuppah, he said, thank you so much for telling me I made a difference to you. And he repeated what he said from 5 years old, you make my writing worthwhile. I write in the hope that there is somebody reading my writing. And there was a consistency of response. And I believe that it was that God, there's actually someone on the other end that gave him hope. And to know that you can make even one difference, as tiny as that might be, is what patiently gives me hope.
It's interesting. I'm not used to a microphone. Is this the right way? It's interesting that the example of all the awful things going on in the world at the moment, that the example you gave is anti-Semitism, because I think that's the only thing I've ever heard him say, Jews can't fight. I think we can definitely try not to make it worse. We can do our best to show the world our best face. But he says, it's evident, if there's an irrational hatred, if someone has an irrational hatred, then the object of that hatred cannot fight it. It has to be fought by people on the side of the hater. And he tells that he met with representatives of the Union of Jewish Students in the UK. University students are really on the front line of anti-Semitism. They perhaps suffer from it the most in the UK. And he said to them, listen, if you are suffering anti-Semitism, what you've got to do is lead the fight against Islamophobia. And what they did was go and set up a joint organisation of Jews and Muslims and Christians. I'm not sure that the Christians got as much out of it, but Jews to fight Islamophobia and Muslims to fight anti-Semitism. And they work together to combat all these hatreds. And I think that's a model that we need to bear in mind here. And I think it's also an example of his general advice when you are suffering or you are up against an adversity or a problem. Try to think of somebody else. This is something that he said to my father. If you the solution, the way to combat sadness is to see who else is suffering and how can I help them. Or in another way that he wrote it, if you're in trouble, ask yourself, what is God asking of me in this situation? So I think his writing helps my optimism has taken a bit of a beating in recent times, but hope and optimism, as Alex says, is two different things. And optimism comes and goes, but hope you're not allowed to give up on. You're not. Despair is fun, and the Isaiah's got a lot to say to the people who feast on the rooftops and say, "Eat, drink, for tomorrow we die." Despair is fun. Moaning is fun. Blaming people is fun. Saying "I told you so" is fun. Being the victim is fun, but we don't have that option. We don't have that privilege. We are mandated to continue to hope, and in the words of the sat nav that you like to quote, recalculate the route. Maybe we took a wrong turn. Maybe someone else took us on a wrong turn. But we are here, we know where we need to go, recalculate the route and keep on going. So I do look to him when my optimism is under attack. I do look to him for hope, and the hope does give me optimism. I think that positivity is something that he worked on. And I think that if you ask where it comes from, and I think two things strike me. One is, I think it was you've been alluding to, he had a sense of mission. You can't get things done if you're in despair. And being in a mode of getting things done helps you not to despair as well. I think if you read a book like, say, The Home We Build Together or The Politics of Hope, you close the book and you feel, yeah, that's what we should do. That's what we need to do. Great, let's do that. And it gives you a great sense of positivity. then you remember he doesn't particularly solve the problem that, not every single one of our leaders is at every moment 100% motivated by the common good. That's sort of, but just being in that mode of thinking of solutions, thinking, okay, here's a problem, what are we going to do about this? It leads you to think, wow, we could. This is what we could do. We could do, if everyone listened to me, then we could do this, and that would solve it. That would be wonderful. Now, of course, nobody's listening to me, but just being in that frame of mind of thinking, what can we do about this? You think of the big thing that you can't do, and then you think, but you know what? I could do that. There's a small thing that I could do. I could get my friend to join me and we can do that. It just puts you into a mode of not being the victim, not blaming, not grumbling, but doing something, and that brings with it a positivity which sort of feeds on itself. And the other thing I think that really helped with his positivity and he manages to give to us, it's just a very bedrock positivity towards other people. I think this is something that he worked on a lot in himself and developed in himself, but I think that that bedrock is a gift that we have from that same grandmother who, by the time you get to be a grandmother, you've really put up with a lot in your life. And she... in the introduction to one of his books, my uncle writes to dedicate this to my father, who would rather lose a friend than compromise a principle, and to my mother, who kept all the friends my father lost. That paints a picture. And how did she do it? Well, she accepted people as they were. She did not expect people to be like her or to do what she liked. She was not the judge, she was not the jury, she accepted people for who they were, and I think she was able to pass that on, and it really helps in life. And I think that from that he developed this focus on other people's strengths. He was not interested in what they'd done wrong or in their weaknesses. He recognized other people's strengths, and as a moment, as an example of a moment that he gave me optimism as opposed to hope. During some talk where he was talking about some, aspects of our culture that are, he considered dangerous and damaging trends, at the end he said that, but this generation of young people, they're amazing. He really, really appreciated what they had and what they gave. I can't remember the exact details of what he said, but there's this generation that really care. And that gave him hope. And I thought, that's what he sees then. Great, I'll hold on to that hope. So I think those are two things that help a lot.
So first of all, thank you very much. That was unbelievable. And I never had a relationship with Rabbi Saxon. I really feel like through the three of you, I feel so much closer to Rabbi Saxon. I really appreciate his Torah on a different level. So really, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for that. If you enjoyed tonight and you want to have more of these type of programs, we always accept donations on our website. So please help Balloon and Fit Midrash continue running these programs in English for the Anglo community throughout the year. We really appreciate that. If anyone wants to come up and schmooze and ask more questions, more than welcome, or there's drinks in the back, help yourself before you leave. Thank you.